Hello my friends, welcome back to my channel. My name is Victoria and today I wanted to share with you my method for how to improve your Korean conversation skills. As you might know from my previous videos, I study Korean. I'm half Korean, but I didn't learn the language growing up. I studied Korean for a year in high school, then another year in college, and then a lot of time passed, and I picked up my Korean studies again a few years ago. Since I started studying Korean again, one of the main things I've been focusing on is my conversation skills. I think conversation skills are some of the most important language skills to have, and they're some of the most satisfying skills to have as well. But they're also some of the most frustrating and slow skill to try to improve. And I think that is especially true if you feel like you are stuck in that intermediate plateau where you've reached an intermediate level of your language, but you just can't seem to improve from there. I felt stuck in the plateau for years, but I got out of it, just barely. I am now an early advanced Korean speaker. My sentences and expressions can be kind of awkward sometimes, but I can usually make myself understood to a Korean person, and if a Korean person is talking to me, as long as the subject is not too difficult, I can usually understand what they are trying to say. So today I wanted to share with you my 3-step method for improving your conversation skills in Korean. This is the exact same method I use to get out of the intermediate plateau finally and go from having really awkward, uncomfortable, stilted conversations to the level I am today. Most of these tips can be generally applied to any foreign language you're learning, whether it's Korean or anything else. So definitely stay tuned even if you are not specifically learning Korean. As I mentioned, this is the method that I use to get from an intermediate level to an early advanced level, so it probably works best for intermediate learners. That said, if you are a beginner Korean speaker or an advanced Korean speaker, I think this method can still be helpful. You just might need to adapt it to be either a little easier or harder depending on your needs. Now let's get started. Step 1. Use italki for weekly conversation practice. When I was squarely in the intermediate plateau, trying to figure out how I could improve my Korean skills, sometimes people would give me unsolicited advice like, why don't you just make some Korean friends and chat with them in Korean? I found this advice extremely frustrating. I was like, okay, yeah, if I were good enough at Korean that I could just make a Korean friend and speak with them and that'd be good enough for me to improve my language skills, yeah, maybe I would just do that. But I was not there yet. I was trying to get there and there seemed so far away from where I was at. I think the just make Korean friends advice can actually be good advice if you used to already speak Korean and maybe it's been several years and so you're just kind of rusty. But outside of those scenarios, I just think that advice is super impractical. It can already be really challenging to make friends as an adult, and just to add a layer on top of that of well, I can barely communicate in the language I'm trying to speak to you. Not to mention, I live in the US, so this person can probably also speak English well, so why would we not just be talking in English if I wanted to actually be their friend? Now with all that said, for improving conversation skills, it is true that you are going to have to practice speaking a lot. But instead of trying to find some random Korean friend to kind of act like your Korean tutor, I'm going to suggest you actually get a Korean tutor. In particular, I recommend that you practice speaking Korean on a language app called italki. If you haven't heard of it before, italki is a website where you can find language tutors for one-on-one tutoring or just conversational language practice. I'm recommending that you use italki for something called free talking, which is just unstructured, free-form conversation with a Korean person. To find this on italki, you can filter the lesson category to conversation practice, which will show tutors who are offering these free talking sessions. Also, I don't know if I even need to say this because I have 70 subscribers and 2 total videos, but I'm not sponsored by italki. I'm not being paid to talk about them. I am just a fan of their service. However, I do have a referral link for italki because every user on italki has a referral link for it. So, if you want to sign up, go ahead and use my link below, and you'll get a discount, and I'll get a discount too. I love italki as a way to get language practice. I even really like that it's paid because it's just really transparent and upfront with like why you are joining the service and what you're trying to get out of it. Like, hello, I am trying to learn Korean and I need to practice speaking. Will you please help me practice speaking Korean? I will pay you for your time. I recommend that you schedule at least 30 minutes of conversation practice a week with either the same person or the same rotation of a few people. The reason why I suggest that you be consistent with your language partner is if you choose a different partner each time, then you're going to kind of have the same introductory conversation over and over again. That actually can make a lot of sense if you're just starting out and you want to practice the same conversation over and over again because you want to build that confidence. Plus, you can find different tutors and like try to find people that you really vibe with. But I think your goal should be to find a few different people or even just one person that you can talk to regularly on a variety of different topics. There's another variation of this which I've also done, which is to schedule 2 30-minute sessions a week with 2 different people. What's really nice about this is you can have the same conversation topic for the first person and the second person. So the earlier conversation in the week ends up being like your practice run, and then you get like a second try at that conversation with the second person. I think this is a really great method if you have more time in your schedule, but if you don't, 30 minutes a week is also fine. So this whole time I've been mentioning specifically the app italki, but of course you don't have to literally use italki for this. The most important thing for this step is to just find a consistent language partner whom you can meet up with every week. If you don't want to pay for anything, one nice free alternative to italki is an app called hellotalk. hellotalk is actually quite a bit different from italki. It's more like a social platform but for language learners. But you can definitely use it for finding language partners and practicing your conversation skills that way. One warning though, I have heard that there are like creepers on hellotalk. I've actually used hellotalk a lot, but more for writing practice than speaking practice. I've actually never had a bad experience on hellotalk, but I also don't use the chat feature. So just be careful out there. It's definitely a great app and I definitely recommend that you try it out. Okay, so now you've got your weekly italki session set up, or maybe you use hellotalk and you have a language partner, you've got your conversation practice scheduled. We're ready to move on to step 2. Practice one thing you struggled with after every conversation. So what I mean by this is, as you're having your conversation with your partner, you should try to pay attention and remember at least one thing that you tended to struggle with during that conversation. If you're like me, you might be like, where do I begin? One is not enough. Like, I can think of a million things that I struggled with. That's fine, but just choose one of those things because you're gonna practice that the next week. So an example for myself. I remembered when I was first starting out with italki and first starting out with conversation practice, I didn't know how to respond with anything other than just like, yes in Korean or ne in Korean. So like, my language partner would say a sentence or tell a story and I would just be like, nah, every single time. So that's what I chose to focus on for the week. How can I like keep a conversation going without just saying nah, nah, nah over and over again? So then after I choose what I'm gonna focus on, I then research that topic. For improving conversation, I usually look at a few different resources. The first one is Korean conversation books and practice dialogues. One particular book that I turn to a lot is called Real Life Korean Conversations at the Intermediate Level. I really like this conversation book because the conversations and language being used is like really natural and there are a ton of them in there. You can use a conversation book actually similar to how you might use a dictionary. But instead of looking for definitions to a word, you are looking for expressions that you might use in different situations. For example, let's open up real-life conversations in Korean. And remember, we are on the hunt for different ways to say yes in a conversation. I just flipped through the textbook and I landed on dialogue 17. And this dialogue happens to have a lot of different ways to say yeah. So perfect. So then I collect these and I add them to my flashcard app. So that's how I use conversation books as a reference. And the second resource that I use for something like this is actually just plain old Korean lessons. Chances are, if you're struggling with some aspect of conversation, other people have struggled with it as well. And so even if it's more broad than a specific grammar pattern or something, there's a pretty good chance that someone has made some content on it. My go-to resource for Korean lessons is Talk to Me in Korean. And it turns out on Talk to Me in Korean, there is actually literally a chapter on how to agree with people in conversations in Korean, because apparently it is a very common problem. So checking out lessons like this is another great way to practice what you might be struggling with in a conversation. Okay, we are now ready for the third and final step of this three-step method, which is to repeat steps 1 and 2. A lot. The intention behind this method is that steps 1 and 2 combine together in sort of a feedback loop. For example, maybe you have your italki session on Monday. During that session, you should pay attention to what you're struggling with and choose one of those things to study throughout the week. Then when the next Monday rolls around and you have your next conversation, you can try to use what you had been practicing and see whether there was any improvement. And then for the next week, you can either choose a new thing to focus on or keep practicing the same thing you were practicing last week. So this method is really simple, but over time, if you keep consistent and you keep repeating this pattern of speaking Korean and practicing what you struggled with, you will see big improvements in your conversation skills over time. So that is the 3-step method for improving your conversation skills. It's a simple system, but it's not easy, so I wanted to leave you with a few more tips if you decide to try this out. Tip number 1, expect progress to feel really, really slow week over week. Like, even if you follow this method to a T and you truly only choose one thing that you try to work on every week after every conversation, there's a good chance that you will not master that in just 1 week. I mean, it's possible that you can, but especially if you're in that intermediate plateau, you are beyond the very basics, and you're probably focusing on more things like creating longer sentences, using more natural expressions, like not saying the same word, yes, over and over again, and incorporating more sophisticated grammar. So it's just not realistic if you expect to be mastering these challenging parts of conversation week after week. To give another example from my own experience, there was a time when I was struggling with this one Korean grammar pattern, which was for the phrase like, I had mistakenly thought. So I practiced it and drilled on it for a week, and with me alone with my textbook, I had felt like I'd mastered it. But then when the next conversation came around, I didn't really feel like I was any better at using that grammar pattern. It was really challenging for me to even realize when were the opportunities for me to use that grammar pattern. And then even when I did, I usually had to stop and think and concentrate in order to create a sentence with the pattern. I couldn't just have it naturally flow as a part of the conversation. In Korean, a lot of sentences are just structured in a very different way than how they would be in English. So to speak more naturally in Korean, you are going to actually have to practice thinking your thoughts in a more Korean structured way. You can't just memorize grammar patterns and you can't just memorize vocabulary. That is why this takes so much practice. I've also found that because of this, sometimes the journey from understanding something in a textbook to being able to use that grammar pattern naturally in a conversation can be a really long one. Like, there are some Korean grammar structures that probably took me 6 months or longer to go from a textbook understanding to a conversational one. But I got there eventually. Anyway, I am saying all of this not to discourage you, but to do the opposite, to encourage you. Like, if you try this method out and week over week you are feeling like, oh my god, I am still struggling with the same grammar patterns, I'm telling you that is super normal. If you keep it up though, you will eventually master these grammar patterns one by one over time, so not week by week, but every month, 3 months, 6 months, a year, you will see huge improvements from where you started. All right, so my last 2 tips are pretty quick. Tip number 2 is to keep consistent and try to practice every week or close to it. That's probably pretty obvious given what I was just talking about, but it's super important, so it felt like it was worth repeating. All aspects of language learning require at least some degree of consistency, but conversation in particular is really like a muscle. If you are not practicing consistently, you will forget things, but if you are practicing consistently, even if you're not practicing very well or very hard, you will get better. This is also why in this 3-step method, I'm not saying that you need to go and have a conversation with someone every single day. And I'm also not saying you have to memorize every single word you forgot and try to practice every single thing you got wrong. But instead, this method is designed to actually be sustainable and something you can stick to for a long period of time. And the final tip I want to leave you with is, remember that this is possible. There are a lot of common and honestly super discouraging misconceptions about language learning. One misconception is that you cannot improve beyond a beginner or intermediate proficiency of a language without living in that country. Another misconception is that you literally just can't learn the language if you didn't learn it by age 12 or something. That trying to learn a language as an adult is basically pointless. I actually used to believe both of those things myself, but neither of them are true. I really wish I had recorded my first italki conversations. I could barely understand what my language partner was saying, and every time I tried to respond, I would have to sit and think and pause forever. But with consistent practice, I got out of that and I can now have conversations at a early advanced level. And all of this happened after I was 30. So don't get discouraged with your language learning journey. I am confident that the same will be true for you too if you keep up with this and practice. All right, my friends, that is all I have for you today. We just covered my 3-step method for how you can improve your Korean conversation skills without having to move to Korea. If you're looking to improve your conversation skills in Korean or any other foreign language, I hope you give this method a try, and please leave a comment below if you do. Or if you use a different method to improve your conversation skills, I would also love to know that too. Comment below and I'd love to learn from you. Finally, if you enjoyed this video, please hit the like button and subscribe to my channel where I'll be sharing all sorts of content on self-studying, language learning, and creative projects. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you next time!